The fight for equality by black people in the United States has been long and challenging, spanning centuries of oppression, injustice, and systemic discrimination. It is a story of resilience, perseverance, and the unyielding desire for human rights and dignity. The journey for equality has involved numerous struggles, key moments, and influential figures that played significant roles in shaping the course of American history. Early struggles and the legacy of slavery. The African presence in what would become the United States began in the early 17th century when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the English colony of Virginia in the year 1607. These enslaved people were forced into labor on plantations, primarily in the southern colonies, where the economy relied heavily on agriculture, particularly the cultivation of tobacco, sugar, and cotton. Over the next 2 centuries, the institution of slavery became entrenched, with laws designed to reinforce racial hierarchies and deny African Americans basic human rights. By the time the United States gained independence from Great Britain in 1776, the population of enslaved Africans was vast, numbering approximately 500,000 people. Slavery was a significant part of the nation's economy and social structure, especially in the South. Enslaved Africans were denied the right to education, ownership, and personal freedom, and were subjected to cruel conditions. Despite the harsh reality of slavery, many enslaved people resisted their circumstances through various forms of rebellion, running away, and passive resistance. The Abolitionist Movement and the Civil War. The Abolitionist Movement, which sought to end slavery in the United States, gained momentum during the early 19th century. In the year 1820, the Missouri Compromise was enacted, allowing for the expansion of slavery into certain new territories, and sparking heated debates in Congress. By the 1830s, abolitionist leaders like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass began to raise awareness about the immorality of slavery, calling for its immediate abolition and the equal treatment of black people. As the movement grew, so did tensions between the North and South, culminating in the Civil War. The war, which began in the year 1861, was fundamentally a conflict over the future of slavery in the United States. The Southern states, heavily reliant on slave labor, sought to maintain the institution, while the Northern states, where industrialization had taken hold, pushed for abolition. In the year 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it marked a turning point in the war and signaled the government's commitment to ending slavery. The Civil War officially ended in the year 1865 with the surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. This victory for the Union marked the beginning of a new era for Black Americans, with the passage of the 13th Amendment in the year 1865, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. Reconstruction and the struggle for rights. Following the Civil War, the United States entered the Reconstruction era, which lasted from 1865 to 1877. This period was characterized by efforts to rebuild the South and integrate former enslaved people into society as free citizens. The 14th Amendment, ratified in the year 1868, granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved individuals. It also guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in the year 1870, granted black men the right to vote. However, the Southern states quickly implemented discriminatory laws, such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses, to disenfranchise black voters. The promise of equality during Reconstruction was met with fierce resistance from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who used violence and intimidation to maintain racial hierarchies. By the year 1877, Reconstruction came to an end with the Compromise of 1877, which allowed Southern states to regain political control in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops. This marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era, which would see the institutionalization of racial segregation and discrimination in the South for decades to come. The Jim Crow era and legal segregation. From the late 19th century into the early 20th century, the Jim Crow era solidified the racial divide in the United States. Laws that mandated racial segregation in public facilities, schools, and transportation became widespread in the Southern states. These laws were upheld by the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in the year 1896, which established the separate but equal doctrine, allowing for legal segregation as long as facilities for black people were deemed equal to those for white people. In reality, however, black facilities were vastly inferior, further entrenching racial inequality. During this period, black Americans faced severe discrimination in all aspects of life, from education to employment opportunities. Violence and intimidation were widespread, with lynching becoming a common form of terror used by white supremacist groups to maintain control over black communities. Despite this, Black people continued to resist, with the rise of movements like the Niagara Movement, founded by W.E.B. Du Bois in the year 1905, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, founded in the year 1909. These organizations fought for civil rights, education, and an end to racial discrimination through legal challenges and public activism. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The Civil Rights Movement, which gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, was a pivotal period in the fight for racial equality in the United States. It was characterized by peaceful protests, legal challenges, and acts of civil disobedience aimed at ending segregation and securing equal rights for Black Americans. One of the key moments that sparked the movement was the arrest of Rosa Parks in the year 1955, after she refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest led to the Montgomery bus boycott, a year-long protest that successfully desegregated public transportation in the city. In the year 1960, a group of Black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, initiated a sit-in at a segregated lunch counter, demanding the right to be served. The sit-in movement spread throughout the South, challenging segregation in public spaces and businesses. These peaceful protests, often met with violence from white supremacists and law enforcement, garnered national attention and helped to galvanize the civil rights movement. One of the most iconic moments of the civil rights movement came in the year 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The march, which drew over 200,000 people, was a call for racial equality, economic justice, and an end to discrimination. The movement led to significant legislative changes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark piece of legislation that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, schools, and employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 followed, eliminating discriminatory practices like literacy tests and poll taxes that had been used to disenfranchise Black voters. The Black Power movement and the continued struggle. While the civil rights movement achieved many victories, the struggle for equality did not end with the passage of these laws. The Black Power movement, which emerged in the late 1960s, was a response to the slow progress in achieving true equality and the persistence of racial violence and economic disparities. Leaders like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and the Black Panther Party called for Black self-determination, pride in Black identity, and an end to police brutality and systemic racism. The Black Power movement was more radical than the earlier civil rights movement, advocating for Black empowerment and independence from white institutions. The Black Panther Party, founded in the year 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, organized community programs such as free breakfast for children and health clinics. The party also monitored police activity in Black neighborhoods to protect citizens from police brutality. Despite the achievements of the civil rights movement, the Black community continued to face systemic inequality, particularly in areas such as housing, education, and employment. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the year 1968 marked the end of an era for the movement, but his legacy continued to inspire future generations of activists. The fight for equality today. The struggle for equality in the United States continues to this day. In recent years, movements like Black Lives Matter, which emerged in the year 2013 following the death of Trayvon Martin, have brought attention to issues such as police violence, racial profiling, and the criminal justice system's treatment of Black people. Protests and demonstrations have erupted across the country, with activists demanding an end to systemic racism and accountability for those responsible for violence against Black individuals. The fight for equality has also been reflected in political and cultural shifts, with more Black people holding positions of power in government, media, and business. In the year 2020, the election of Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president marked a historic moment, as Harris became the first Black and South Asian woman to hold the office of vice president. These milestones, while significant, represent just one step in a much longer journey toward full equality and justice for Black Americans. In conclusion, the fight for equality by Black people in the United States has been long and arduous, characterized by both triumphs and setbacks. From the era of slavery to the civil rights movement and beyond, Black Americans have consistently struggled for their right to be treated as equal citizens. While progress has been made, the ongoing fight for racial justice reminds us that the journey is far from over. The legacy of centuries of systemic racism still affects Black communities today, and the struggle for true equality requires continuous effort. The fight for justice and equal rights remains a vital part of the American story, as it highlights the nation's ongoing quest to live up to its founding ideals of liberty and equality for all, modern movements and the path forward. In recent years, there has been a renewed focus on addressing systemic inequality, particularly within the criminal justice system. Movements such as Black Lives Matter have gained international recognition, advocating for justice for victims of police brutality and calling for widespread reforms to address racial disparities in policing, sentencing, and incarceration. The deaths of George Floyd in the year 2020, Breonna Taylor in the year 2020, and Ahmaud Arbery in the year 2021 reignited protests across the United States and around the world, highlighting the urgent need for change. Protesters and activists have called for defunding the police and reinvesting in community-based services to address the root causes of inequality. The movement has also brought attention to the disparities in healthcare, education, housing, and employment that disproportionately affect Black Americans. These systemic issues, which have persisted for generations, continue to perpetuate cycles of poverty and inequality in Black communities. Alongside protests and activism, legal reforms are being pursued to create lasting change. In the year 2021, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act was introduced in Congress, aiming to end qualified immunity for law enforcement officers, ban chokeholds, and implement national standards for policing practices. While the legislation faced significant opposition and was not passed in its original form, it signaled a commitment to addressing police violence and racial discrimination in law enforcement. Moreover, Black leadership has continued to grow in both the political and cultural spheres. The election of individuals like Stacey Abrams, a leading advocate for voting rights in Georgia, and the appointment of numerous Black people to positions of influence in business and entertainment, signals a shift toward greater representation and empowerment. However, challenges remain, especially with efforts to restrict voting rights and suppress political participation among Black voters, particularly in southern states. Cultural contributions and Black identity. Despite the challenges, Black Americans have made immense contributions to American culture, shaping the nation's arts, music, literature, and social movements. From the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, which celebrated Black creativity and culture, to the rise of hip-hop in the late 20th century, Black Americans have consistently influenced American culture in profound ways. Black literature, including works by authors such as Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Maya Angelou, and James Baldwin, has illuminated the struggles and triumphs of Black people in the United States, while also contributing to the broader narrative of American identity. The rise of the Black Lives Matter movement has also brought a new focus on the celebration of Black culture and the reclamation of Black history. Efforts to teach a more inclusive history, including the history of slavery, segregation, and the civil rights movement, are now being seen in schools and museums across the country. While there are still ongoing debates about how history should be taught, the acknowledgement of Black experiences and contributions is a step toward creating a more equitable future. Additionally, Black artists, athletes, and leaders continue to break barriers and inspire future generations. In the arts, figures such as Beyoncé, Kendrick Lamar, and Ava DuVernay use their platforms to address issues of racial injustice and celebrate Black pride. In sports, athletes like LeBron James and Colin Kaepernick have become symbols of resistance, using their visibility to speak out against racism and police brutality, economic inequality, and the ongoing struggle. One of the most persistent challenges faced by Black Americans is economic inequality. Despite progress in education and employment opportunities, Black Americans still experience significantly lower rates of wealth accumulation compared to white Americans. The median household wealth for Black families in the year 2020 was approximately 1/10 of that for white families. This gap is a result of systemic barriers to access to education, homeownership, and employment opportunities, as well as the historical effects of slavery, segregation, and discriminatory housing policies. The fight for economic justice is closely linked to the fight for racial justice. Advocates argue that closing the racial wealth gap is essential for achieving true equality. Economic disparities are also evident in healthcare, where Black Americans are more likely to experience lower quality care, higher rates of chronic illness, and shorter life expectancies. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed these inequalities in a stark way, as Black communities experienced disproportionately high infection and death rates. Efforts to address economic inequality include movements for reparations, which seek to provide financial compensation for the descendants of enslaved people, as well as policies aimed at improving access to education, healthcare, and affordable housing. While reparations remain a controversial topic, with different proposals and approaches being debated, they represent a growing recognition of the need to address the historical and systemic factors that have contributed to economic disparities. The role of education in achieving equality. Education has long been seen as a pathway to equality, and Black Americans have fought for equal access to quality education since the end of the Civil War. The landmark Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision in the year 1954 declared that separate but equal facilities were inherently unequal and mandated the desegregation of public schools. However, desegregation was met with resistance, and many schools remained segregated for decades after the ruling. In recent years, efforts to improve educational opportunities for black children have continued, with initiatives aimed at addressing disparities in school funding, access to advanced placement courses, and school discipline practices. Many advocates also argue for a greater emphasis on culturally relevant curricula that acknowledge the history and contributions of black people. These efforts are essential for leveling the playing field and ensuring that black students have the tools they need to succeed in an increasingly competitive world. The long road ahead. The fight for racial equality in the United States is an ongoing struggle. While significant progress has been made since the days of slavery and segregation, systemic racism continues to affect many aspects of life for black Americans. The struggle for justice and equality requires continued activism, legislative reform, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of racial inequality. The fight for equality is not only a fight for black Americans but for the soul of the nation itself. To move forward, America must confront its history, acknowledge the continuing impacts of racism, and work toward building a more inclusive and just society for all.